Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Parker, pronoun she, her, and I am the Director of Transgender Equality for Equality Florida. And I'm so excited to be here sharing space with you all virtually. It's been a while since we've done a trans chat, and I just want to thank everyone who is joining us today. So I have to say, even though I'm excited to be sharing space with you all today, the topic that we're going to talk about, it really does hit home personally. As many of you know, the Florida Department of Health has issued recommendations broadly opposing gender-affirming care for trans youth. And the Florida's Agency for Healthcare Administration, or also known as AHCA, is on the road to restricting healthcare for transgender Floridians. As we know, trans people are constantly attacked. Trans people are the target and are used as political pawns constantly. And as a trans person, it bothers me, it hurts me, because a lot of the folks that are putting these recommendations together, or a lot of the folks that are putting these guidelines together, have never met someone like me, have never met a trans person or trans youth who this is truly going to affect. So today's conversation, we have amazing panelists, and we are going to sit and talk about, what does gender affirming care look like? What does that even mean? And kind of break down what exactly the DOH recommendations and the AHCA notice that's happening. We're going to talk about that. And also, a big thing that we need from you all that are viewing. AHCA is having a hearing on Friday regarding this, but they are accepting public comments. So we need you to go to the website that will be pasted in the comments to make public comment talking about how gender affirming care is life-saving, how gender affirming care is needed, because at the end of the day, healthcare should be accessible for everyone. So I want to welcome our three amazing panelists, Dr. Howell, Dr. Kasseri, and Nathan Brumer. Hello. How's everyone doing today?
Good.
Good. All right. Well, I want to let you all go ahead and introduce yourself, so we can start with Dr. Howell.
Thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Gary Howell. I'm a clinical psychologist in Tampa. Most of my practice really revolves around working with LGBT folks, and I do have a large percentage of my patient population that identify as trans, and I work a lot with trans youth, where we do a lot of free group psychotherapy for support groups for them. And so this has certainly been on the forefront of a lot of my patients, so I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Kasseri.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ramis Kasseri, pronouns he, they, and I'm an internist and a pediatrician. So I see children and adults, and I have my own private practice as part of FSU in Tallahassee. I'm one of the few providers in town that does hormone therapy. So obviously, if this were to, move forward, this definitely would impact a sizable portion of my patient population.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And Nathan?
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. My name's Nathan Brumer. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an attorney and an advocate, and I'm proud to serve the state of Florida as the LGBTQ consumer advocate, appointed by Commissioner Nikki Fried within the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so let's jump into this. So we have a lot kind of to dissect tonight, but first and foremost, there's this term that has been used a lot, and we of course know what it means, but there may be folks that don't. So what is gender affirming care? And I'll throw that to you first, Dr. Howell.
For me, it's kind of recognizing, from a psychological perspective, depending on the age, but for kids, it's really creating a space for children and adolescents to live as they are and be comfortable in their own skin. And some of that affirmative process really is around social transition, which a lot of, the data out there supports that, especially with non-binary kids. Not having a space for social transition is actually dangerous for mental health. And we've seen that time and time again. So the social transition piece is really what I focus on with youth, and kind of working with families and the children to get to a place of where they can be comfortable, both at school and at home. Some of that is advocating on their behalf with school systems. I constantly am writing letters to educators saying, please, in the best of your ability, use the pronouns that the child would like you to use, because that one makes them psychologically more healthy, but it also keeps them from feeling one, misgendered, and possibly suicidal, because that's definitely something I deal with a lot in my practice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And it's so important to create safe spaces for folks, especially kids, because we all remember just trying to find out where we fall on this earth, and where we want to go and how we want to live. And especially when it comes to kids transitioning, there's a lot of rhetoric out there that is just simply not true. So thank you so much for what you do. So how about you, Dr. Kasari? What is gender affirming care when it comes to your work?
So for me, it goes a little bit step further in terms of, as Dr. Howell mentioned, we talk about social affirmation, but there are other avenues to explore in terms of affirming your gender identity. Some of that may be maybe by medicine, some of that might be by surgery, and some of that might be by legal document where you change your gender marker. Those are the areas that I am able to help in. And I want to touch on a comment that you just mentioned, because I often teach this to medical students. I find it fascinating as I grew older and I learned more and I started changing my verbiage when talking about gender and sexuality. It was so eye-opening to see what the youth responds with. If you allow a safe space for a child to exist where you take the parent out of the room and you're allowing them to express themselves, you'd be surprised by what the response you get. But it's often followed with, yes, but can you please not tell my parent yet? Or can you please keep this between us? So there's a lot of complexity to the conversation we're having. And I don't think, at least for me, what makes me angry is that the focus is on all the wrong things. We're not focusing on the well-being of those children, but we continue to find ways to harm them.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, it gets, navigating who you are gets very, very difficult. And I remember for me, it took me coming to terms with it a long time I knew that I was trans, but I was scared to say it. I didn't think society was going to accept me. So I kind of went in and I was like, I'm going to be everything but that. And then you finally get to a point where you just can't deny it anymore. And you just have to realize, like, this is me, and I'm going to take the necessary steps to do that. So thank you so much. And how
If I may add just to that, is that one of also the misconceptions is when we talk about trans care, that means medications and surgeries, which is not true. Is that everyone's journey is individual, everyone's path to their own self is different. So also that mindset of when we're providing hormone affirming care, or we're providing transgender inclusive care, that we're pushing medication, we're pushing surgeries, and that's not necessarily, that's entirely untrue.
Yeah, it's this idea that it's this one cookie cutter way of being trans or non-binary, and it's not. You know what I mean? However you express yourself is valid. However you want to go about living is valid, and not everybody takes the time to even go through a medical transition. Some folks don't do surgeries or anything of that nature, and some do. But regardless of that fact, those should be available, and no one should get in between a medical provider and their patient. So for you, Nathan, as a fellow trans person, what is gender affirming care to you?
Yeah, I think I'm going to go even a step further. I think as I get older, the things that might come across my medical file has, of course, changed and evolved. And I transitioned quite a lot of years ago. Although I'm not an elder yet, so let's be clear about that. But I find gender affirming care necessary in all my medical needs, right? And so if I'm stepping in with other issues, pick a system of the body, there is an awareness and education that as a consumer, I hope and expect my physician would have. And I think as we thrive and our community seeks out healthcare, right? We resist healthcare because those are spaces maybe we haven't often felt affirmed. And I have built years of education with physicians I've been fortunate to find, but in my early years, there were very few affirming physicians, and I'm grateful for the volume that has really increased over the last decade or two. And so it's interesting to see the evolution from Dr. Howell to Dr. Kasari, and then I think from the patient perspective, we have needs beyond that, right? That will continue as we age, and that knowledge and depth is growing as well. And so, and I don't want to stay in the personal stories too much, but I have siblings over the years who have not approached healthcare, especially transmasculine folks, cardiovascular healthcare. I have lost siblings who weren't willing to engage with the medical system because of a breakdown in trust, and that it would focus on our identity instead of our medical needs. And I think that's trans affirming as well.
Absolutely. It's really just understanding that just because we're trans or our experience may not be widely understood doesn't mean that it's negative or doesn't mean that it's something wrong. It's just simply different. And that's okay. Imagine the world was all the same. Imagine we were all the same. It would just be blah, you know what I mean? But the fact that we're all different and we all have different needs, I think that's a beautiful thing. And I just wish people would open up their eyes and understand that healthcare is something that everyone deserves. Healthcare is something that we all need. And just because maybe it's not understood or it's something you haven't heard of before doesn't mean that it should be taken away. So I want to put this question out, and anyone can kind of jump in. Why do you believe this topic is so politicized?
That's a loaded question.
Where do we start?
Yeah.
I think that there's definitely misinformation that is being perpetuated quite a bit, and a narrative that doesn't make sense and a narrative that's not consistent. From my standpoint, talking from the medical field, I don't understand how science was not involved as part of the conversation. When we look at some of the recommendation and guidelines that came out, it's clear that you're cherry picking which data that you're looking at and which information that you're leading with. At no point in time did I see a sense of let's truly put the children first and foremost at the forefront of our focus. Let's talk about the trans children and their experience. Let's talk about how hormone blockers could potentially give them a life that is significantly different than without them, and how that would impact their career trajectory, how that would impact their mental health, and all of the positive things that can come out of that. Unfortunately, the focus is not children, and that's kind of what people need to realize, is that this is attack on children, period. It's not even just about trans youth, it's about youth in general, because at some point in time when we start policing bodies, we're policing everyone's bodies. And if we look at statistics and look at, what are the numbers, how many in a group of 100 students is a member of the LGBT community, whether or not trans, it's a small percentage, but the things that the policies that we're putting in place are still going to impact the other 90 children. So there is a sense of lack of awareness and lack of intention. What is our goal? If it is truly to help children, then those policies don't make sense. There's a hidden agenda, and what we're seeing is just the front for it.
Absolutely. How about you, Dr. Howell? Why do you think this is so politicized?
Yeah, kind of on the same lines. Like we spend a lot of time in the psychology field, those who are non-clinical and clinical, who really spend time researching trans patients, and really a part of what that looks like, especially for what we know with the social affirming process for non-binary kids, but even for trans youth, there's no science behind what was issued in the so-called guidelines that came out from DOH. Like if you look through those and you dig a little deeper, even the use of the Merck manual, which in and of itself has its own problems, but when you go down a few paragraphs after what they've quoted, that information even highlights the social process is important to consider, especially for trans youth, because it creates a safe and affirming place for them to experience the earlier years of their life and their gender identity that they feel comfortable with, so that it allows them to have a quote unquote normal childhood, whatever that looks like, whatever we define normal as.
Absolutely. How about you, Nathan?
Yeah, I think the fact that it exists in a political sphere is in and of itself problematic, right? That the why, we can sort of make arguments about why we've sort of ended up here. It's not just in Florida; it's happening across the country, and there's a commonality, but there's a uniqueness about what I think is happening in Florida for sure. I'm born and raised here. This is my home. I've seen a lot of things sort of develop. And there's a narrative first around youth. And so if we looked at the DOH memo, which we may talk about a little further, but then AHCA then is also then talking about how we police adult bodies. And so that narrative is expanding, certainly. So from a protection of individual rights and liberties, and in protecting how we are consumers in our healthcare, we want to be informed and educated and active participants and have recourse should something go wrong. It's science. Dr. Kazari, started exactly where this conversation should have started. So if I look to those documents that have come forward, remarkably thin on any kind of evidentiary basis, and folks as active participants, as consumers, should be asking why. And the other thing is, from a due process perspective, this has been done very quietly and quickly, and folks should also be asking why. And that's unfortunately been a bit par for the course in recent years in Florida politically, but that should certainly cause great concern and should activate folks to get involved.
I definitely agree, because as we kind of talk about and break down these things, the Department of Health saying, that healthcare for children, for trans children, is not recommended, and AHCA wanting to take away healthcare from 10,000 plus trans and non-binary patients on Medicaid. The one thing that we're seeing so often is that in these, there's not enough science, there's not enough evidence. But I will tell you, as a trans person, I transitioned 10 years ago. I have never been given a survey. I've never been asked anything of that nature. So what's interesting to me is there's not enough evidence or science, but I think they're intentionally not asking. You know what I mean? If I go to a affirming care place, yes, I'm asked about my experience and things like that. But these larger organizations, we're not seeing them do that. So I want to ask, what do you say to folks who claim that gender affirming care is not based on science or not based on evidence, or that it's not helpful to youth or trans adults? I'll start with you, Dr. Kazari.
So by no means am I a business expert, but I know medicine. So let me kind of draw a little bit of parallels. When we talk about hormone therapy and trans individual care, we're talking about estrogen and testosterone. Estrogen and testosterone exist outside of transgender care for different reasons. So inherently, from a business standpoint and from a pharmaceutical standpoint, there is no interest in studying those compounds for that population. Then add the layer of, it's not like the transgender and non-binary folks represent 90% of the population. So this is something very widely profitable for companies to be investing the time and money into that research. So to comment on that, it's pure laziness and it's pure lack of profit to create interest in learning this information. It's not because transgender patients don't exist, nor does it mean that they don't benefit from the treatment. It means that big pharma have not found a good reason to study the population yet. And if we come to a space where that changes or a particular formulation is needed, that might change. But I don't foresee that happening in the future because, as I said, estrogen and testosterone are still widely used even outside of hormone care.
Absolutely. Dr. Howell, I want to ask you, so say this AHCA notice goes through and healthcare is removed from 10,000 plus trans folks that are on Medicaid. What impact will that have on their mental health?
Oh, I mean, it's already having an impact. I've seen an explosion of cases where, people have been in a pretty good place mental health wise, like they've worked on a lot of the challenges that they've had. And, it's almost like every week there's something new that we're focusing on that's related to LGBT issues. And lately with this, I just had a group last week and the whole topic of conversation shifted to the Medicaid issue. And what does this mean with the government trying to regulate what I do with my body and what I do with my medications and what I do with, with myself. And most of the patients who haven't been suicidal, I've seen that increase, in my own patient population, and I can't imagine what others are seeing as well. But I work with a lot of college age patients, I work with a lot of youth, and even some of my older patients who are in their late 50s, early 60s, some in their early 70s, similar kinds of experiences of where we've gone months, if not years, having a lot of stability from a mental health perspective, suddenly coming back in. I had an influx of patients calling to come back in after a 7 or 8 month hiatus from therapy because they were doing well, just to address this topic. So it is certainly taking a toll on mental health. But as we know, with a lot of these issues, when people feel their rights are being taken away, it does create a sense of helplessness and hopelessness and an increase of depressive symptoms. But mostly right now, I see a lot of anxiety. And for some people, that exacerbates past trauma that's already there. So you see some of that kind of resurfacing, because it is kind of a interwoven mix of mental health symptoms that are affected by some of these proposed changes.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to ask, so on the opposite side of that, when your patients are able to access gender affirming care, how does that make them feel? What are you seeing when patients are being able to access that?
I can say, and I have this conversation with parents frequently, for especially for some of my trans youth who want to wear a binder for the first time. And there's a lot of opposition in families to kind of start some of that process. But just, the first day that their child puts it on and they see that glow on their face and they see this kind of complete shift in the way that they feel and they act and they're laughing and they're happy, that's the moment where parents are like, okay, that makes sense. It finally is clicking for me what this really means. And so when kids and adults are getting the affirming care, both from their families and also from healthcare providers, we see the positive mental effects of that. We see less depression, less anxiety, and we know that people who engage in the medical affirming care with whether it be hormone replacement or whether it be just blockers for some of my patients is enough to help shift the mental picture a lot.
I agree with that. When I first started my transition, I was taking black market hormones. I didn't know how to access resources. I didn't know how to find a clinic or a hospital or a space that was affirming. And even just doing that, I noticed while that's extremely unsafe and I didn't know my levels and things of that nature, I was just so happy and just feeling like I'm finally taking that necessary step. And that's what I don't think people truly understand, is that we're all on this pursuit of happiness. And when us trans folks are able to access that, it just allows us to truly be who we are, instead of this whole, all the rhetoric that we hear that, it's fear mongering. If it's easier to take away our humanity, and once they do that, then it's easier for folks to demonize us. It's easier for folks to want to take away our rights because they don't see us as human. And I wish people would just understand that we're all just trying to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
Nathan, I want to ask you, so as a trans person as well, accessing gender affirming care, how has that changed your life?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were just speaking, because 2 decades ago, when I was moving forward with my family's support, there were very few resources in Florida. And so I picked up and left and went to the West Coast. So when I really appreciated Dr. Kazari's answer to that prior question. I come from a big science family. I was a former science teacher in public schools in Florida, and there was so little. And Seattle, Portland, California, up and down the coast, so many resources decades ago. And that was just a phenomenal moment for me, for my family. And there was access. There was a sliding scale, so there was financial access. There was a community group. There was a community center. There were all the things around, right? Mental, physical, emotional well-being, and it was very easy to access all of that. And it was something that was nearly impossible for me in Florida. And so I think about where we are right now, and I am grateful. These resources are just a tip of the iceberg, right? That we see on the call right now. There are tremendous resources, right? And there's great concern, I think, in and around communities in Florida. And so, I mean, we have a great, urban and rural divide, but we have great online care, especially with, the ability to access mental health services online. There are resources. And so I want to encourage those to continue, right? But there are also things that are not changing as we talk about this, right? And so we've looked at this, and I think you're going to probably get us there with what this DOH memo means, what the AHCA, specifically means. But there are coverages and great care and great providers, private insurers continuing to cover care, and nothing has changed yet, right? And there's a process in moving forward with that. And so as much as we create focus and attention on this too, I also want to sort of balance that with some good news. And I'm so grateful as my, contact list continues to grow. There are so many folks leaning in and doing phenomenal work from the Keys all the way up to the Panhandle, and every part's in between. So.
Yes, and thank you so much for that, because, as we see attack after attack, it is easy to feel hopeless, to feel like things just are kind of falling apart. But I want everyone out there to remember there are folks fighting. We are fighting every single day. We have providers who are standing where they are and saying, I am going to support trans and non-binary people regardless. We have people who are in the political realm that are fighting every day to push back against this. So even though it may feel hopeless, please know that there are people fighting for you, and we have to continue to stay hopeful, because one thing our community knows how to do is fight. And we've had to fight for years. We've had many, many, many battles, and there will be more battles. But I want you all to understand that we're in this together, and we are going to continue to push back. So Nathan, I do want to, since we were just talking, kind of want to talk about the DOH guidelines. And I know we've kind of talked about how that will affect the community, but can you break that down a little bit more for us? As we know, they issued recommendations broadly opposing gender-affirming care for trans youth, but what are some more things that you're kind of seeing in the work that you do?
Yeah, so I think it was a shot across the bow, right? It created a pretty strong response amongst advocates and providers and families and parents and those that love and care and support the community. And I think it was meant to do that, right? So administrative law is not particularly exciting, but there are a lot of nuances there, right? And so in our government, we have 3 branches, and often there's a lot of political power and ability to change administrative guidelines, right? And different state agencies have the ability to do that based on Florida law. DOH has an ability to send a memo and says, hey, we encourage this. Now, the consensus amongst practitioners is that it's a non-binding memo. But it was a first step, right? So it means you're not beholden to do anything. It didn't change anything, but it said, hey, we're moving forward on this. There was a follow-up letter, and then there's the second step, which is the AHCA piece, which we'll talk about, I assume, separately. But I think the most alarming thing about that DOH memo was this idea went much further than any of the other states who have been really going after healthcare for trans adolescents as well as adults, and said, we don't even think there's good science on social transition, which is shocking. I mean, I, not only as a human, as a former educator, as someone who ran an LGBTQ youth center, who has leaned on experts like Dr. Howell and Dr. Kazari, there's decades and decades. It is just, I think there are a lot of folks who are sort of struggling to say, how do you even respond to this? And experts have done that. They did that in a great memo from Texas and provided great testimony. But it is a complicated conversation. If it's a headline on the news, and it's of this very broad kind of headline. It often, grabs someone's attention, and folks have no idea how to enter into even understanding that, because they're not trans, or they're not a family member or a caretaker or a loved one who's needed to go down that pathway. And it's a big conversation to have in a soundbite. Almost impossible.
Definitely agree with that. And I think, a bit of that is done intentionally. A lot of it's done intentionally. The verbiage comes out. Same with the AHCA notice, where they're saying that they're looking at removing healthcare from trans and non-binary folks that are on Medicaid. All of that verbiage is meant to be confusing. All that verbiage is meant to not be able to be read easily, so folks don't really know. And once again, for folks that are listening in, on July 8th, this Friday, AHCA is having a hearing, but they are accepting public comments up until the 8th. So there will be a link posted in the chat, and please go there and make public comments talking about how gender-affirming care is life-saving, how gender-affirming care is needed. If you're a trans or non-binary person, please talk about your experience. Talk about why gender-affirming care has saved your life. And they definitely have to look at all of those comments. Oh, go ahead, Nathan.
No, I was going to say, Nicole, just because, engaging with government agencies can be a little frightening. So I want folks to know, out at that link, not only is it your ability to enter comments, but Southern Legal Counsel, Land Illegal, all the other partners in the consortium have information out there. They've answered FAQs. They've got a little bit more information to get you ready. And any person, you do not need to be an expert to submit comments, right? And so this is your way to engage to civil, from a civil perspective. And I really I wanted to add that little layer, because it can seem really technical, but that website breaks it down and makes it super easy.
Yes, absolutely. Please don't be intimidated by it. If you have any questions, please reach out. But yes, there are FAQs. There are different things on there. There's a toolkit as well that's going around. So please, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. So Dr. Kasari, I do want to ask you this. We've heard a lot of false claims that puberty blockers and hormones are irreversible treatments for children, and they're being demonized. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that puberty blockers were created for cisgender children in the very beginning, and all of these things. So can you talk a bit about that?
I'm glad you asked me that question, Nicole, because I want to unpack this. And if you let me, I want to unpack it in relation to the sports ban, because that is another huge piece of misinformation. So I want to make the science behind it as simple as possible. So human beings, the fetus, when a baby is born, biologically, we're all born as X and Y, a biological female. The testosterone, or I'm sorry, a female, the X and Y later is the Y is the male chromosome. That's the thing around puberty that changes the trajectory of the body and introduces the masculinization features. But by default, the body is made biologically from the get-go. The Y chromosome is the one that changes our trajectory and creates the quote-unquote two biological genders that we have. So when puberty is coming up, what puberty blockers do is just slow down time. They are allowing the body a little bit more time. And the reason for that is that if you were to provide hormone therapy and kind of rush through puberty, you might rush into closing the growth plates in a child's body. So that would not allow them to get as tall as they would have gotten otherwise, or get to their full body height. So hormone blockers are not doing anything in terms of change per se. They're just kind of putting a pause until you have more conversation and you are ready to take the step further, which is the hormone therapy. That's if we're talking about the youth kind of time period. If we are talking about past puberty, those changes has already happened. The Y chromosome, if we're talking about biological men, has already kicked in. And so that's when you get the deepening of the voice, more of the different muscle distribution and all of that. So once you hit puberty, there's kind of no going back. You're able to be on hormones, but there's no point of the blockers anymore. That opportunity has passed. So when we're talking about trans youth, we already have a lot of data about how harassment happens in school, how bullying happens, verbal abuse, physical abuse. Why? Because they look a certain way, they talk a certain way, they dress a certain way. Hormone blockers, if they are used early enough and then hormone therapy is given right afterwards, basically for a transgender person, that allows them to develop and grow into the gender they see themselves in. So, from a social standpoint, from kind of development standpoint, it checks off so many boxes for a transgender individual to have a very successful social experience and a medical experience. So it's not, it's the opposite of what's being perpetrated in the media, that it's so harmful and it's doing this and it's doing that. It's actually, it's providing the support medically and socially to the youth that they need. And if you are using hormone blockers early on, then that argument about the sports ban with the advantage that you get, that doesn't make sense anymore. Because if you used hormone blockers, that biology never happened. And the biology that you're given to that child is the one that matches their identity. So at the end of the day, they're just developing into the gender that they see themselves in.
Thank you so much for that. And Dr. Howe, I want to ask you, so we have a lot of folks watching here, and say there is a parent whose child said that they're trans, they don't necessarily know how to navigate that. What is some advice that you would give them?
Sure. Like so a lot of my consultation with parents is just around kind of explaining what gender identity is. For a lot of parents, while sexual orientation and gender identity are kind of overlapping concepts, they are also separate constructs. So kind of looking at what that looks like across the lifespan, what to expect as their child continues to develop, but also just to kind of have a basic understanding of what gender identity is and what dysphoria is, because a lot of parents don't really have a full concept of what that means. All they know is that their child is struggling, and that struggle could be, learning issues, that could be attention issues, that could be depression. And all of that could just be, a symptom of the gender dysphoria that maybe they're not comfortable expressing to their parents. And so a lot of that, I always try to commend parents for getting to the step of actually coming in, because it's a big step for parents to get to that place where they actually bring their child in. And just kind of affirm that that's the first step, and the first step of many steps ahead of them. And I also try not to sugarcoat things for them. I really want parents to know the full implications of keeping your child kind of blocked from moving forward in their process, of the psychological implications of that, misgendering. I've had parents over the years who, when they get angry, they misgender their children on purpose because they're angry. And that has a really devastating impact on social development, as well as just general mental health concerns, and really kind of having some education around that process, but just trying to be parents that show up and love their child for who they are. Their personality is not any different. They don't identify with the gender that was assigned to them at birth. So really kind of helping parents work through that process. A lot of times there's this concern about grieving. And I always tell parents, you're not grieving the loss of your child. Your child is still there. The personality is still there. The kid that you gave birth to is still there. It's just the gender is not what you thought it was going to be. So kind of working with them through that process, and really working through what that social affirmation process looks like for kids as they get ready to navigate the school setting, with name and pronouns. Are they going to change any physical characteristics with their hair, their clothing, and just get parents really prepared for all of that. I recommend a lot of reading for parents, because there are a lot of great books out there for parents who are going through this, whether it be a pediatric case or an adolescent case. Just having them kind of look at affirming research and literature that's there for parents to use.
Thank you so much for that. And I do want to acknowledge that it can be scary as a parent, not knowing what a transition is going to look like for your child. But just like Dr. Howell said, understanding that still is your child. They're not going anywhere. They're still there. They're still exactly who you know. And they're just becoming more of who they are. They're just living authentically. So it is okay to be scared. It's okay to not know, but the best thing that you can do is go see someone like Dr. Howe to process that, to be able to talk through those things and ask those questions that you want to ask. So Nathan, I want to ask you, say there is a trans or non-binary adult that's thinking of taking that next step to living authentically. What's something that you would tell them?
Well, congratulations. Go you. Welcome home. I mean, it's a big step. I know that. And, you know, everyone's needs as they come into that might be different, right? They might not have told anyone else. I could have been the first person they shared that with, right? And so I might, you know, ask, you know, is this something, you know, that I should keep private? You know, everyone's journey and ability to share that is their own journey and is wholly unique and at their pace, with their timing, with the affirming folks and family members they choose. So it would really, it's a very lawyer answer, but the answer would be it depends. But I would be so overjoyed and would, you know, share that in a great way. And if there was a resource need, certainly ask. And be grateful and honored to share those resources. But yeah, over the years as an educator and as an advocate, it's happened a few times, and it's different. It's an evolving thing for sure, depending on where you live. And but I'm grateful too. Not only is the science and the medicine and the advocates evolving, families are evolving, and coming to, you know, experts to understand what that transition process is like for the individual, but for the family as a whole, to provide an even more affirming and supportive, holistic, you know, whole family wraparound support structure, which is phenomenal. And unfortunately, not everyone is able to have that support. And then we have our chosen family, and those are pretty special too. So. Yeah, no, it's that coming out is still, I think, quite significant. And I appreciate the question to sort of acknowledge that. There are some phenomenal folks thriving. There are great success stories. I mean, we do have to focus on this, you know, the focus on the medical care needs, because it is still lacking. Access is still an issue. And I balance that sometimes with struggling with an over pathologizing of our existence, right? I mean, there are amazing examples of how these things play out and are thriving, happiness, you know, joyful celebrations of our life. And I also want to echo those stories of success as well. Sometimes I don't think we get enough of a chance to do that. We did a lot of that during June, during Pride Month, but we got to share some of those good stories too.
Thank you for that. It's so true, because, you know, it is scary. It is going to be a journey, but it's going to be a beautiful journey. Every journey is going to have the bumps in the road, but just know that, like Nathan said, you can have a chosen family. You're not alone. You know, when we kind of come to that decision and you kind of stand in that, I know for me, I was willing to lose my family, lose my friends. I didn't know how people were going to react, but I knew that I just wanted to myself. And choosing you first and foremost is amazing. It's incredible. It takes a lot of people a long time to do that. So congratulations on that. And also just understanding that you're not alone. There is a question in the comment section that I wanted to ask either Dr. Howe or Dr. Kasari, or both. Can you explain trans care outside of medicine and surgery? So I know we kind of talked about there's different ways to access care, but can one of you or either both of you kind of explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about from my perspective, you know, from a mental health standpoint and psychology standpoint, part of that is just kind of building social support systems in place for the child to have a healthy trajectory in terms of their social development as well as their psychological development. Building that support system outside of the family. You know, one of the things that families often struggle with is coming out, not only for the trans youth or the non-binary youth, but the family comes out as well. And there needs to be some coaching sometimes on how that looks as a family. Who do you tell? When do you come out as a family? When is it safe? You know, a lot of that really stems around what is safest for the child. So really trying to look at making sure that all of the things that we're concerned about in terms of attachment, that's really important in child development, and that all of that continues to move forward as necessary, or it does lead to longer term situations in adulthood that affect relationships and ability to be successful. So really trying to create a balance from a psychological perspective is really what I focus on.
Absolutely.
And then to kind of like complement that, the way I look at it, kind of, I think Nathan said it very well in the beginning. In terms of us, we need to get to a space where we're providing well-rounded care. We're not providing just trans care. We're just providing care for the person. So one of the important kind of conversation to have is that within the trans community, we have higher rates of things. We have higher rates of depression, we have higher rates of suicide, we have higher rates of substance abuse. None of these things are happening because that person is transgender, but they are a product of their transgender experience that led them, for whatever reason, to that space. So as a provider, as a primary care doctor, my job is to focus on that, to look at their overall health, to look at their, social life. Is there something that they are struggling with? If there is something from a health standpoint that they need, I should be able to take care of that. I think, yes, we're right now fighting for the bare minimum, which is being able to at least prescribe hormone care. But I think taking care of a trans individual is way more than that. We have to take into consideration the entire person, because there are a lot of circumstances where medically I can't prescribe hormones.
Absolutely. Uh-oh. I think he might have froze.
That was a clip.
Right.
Stay tuned for part 2. But just generally speaking, that I think it's looking at the person as a whole, not just focusing on one thing you're doing for them.
Absolutely. Yes, it's overall care. We are talking right now about gender affirming care and that specifically, but it's just care as a human being. Human beings all need care in different ways, and being able to access that and being able to provide that. So this has been a phenomenal conversation. And as we wrap things up, I want to go to each of you. We talked about some heavy stuff here, and I want to kind of end on a positive note. So I'll start with you, Nathan. What are some encouraging words that you could give trans or non-binary folks that may be, really worried with everything that's going on with the DOH guidelines and the AHCA notice?
Yeah. Well, the things I think that need to always be said, right? We're here and you're not alone. And there have been folks in Florida and across the country fighting the fight for a long time. And not everyone else is able or should step into like the advocate role, and so I also want to I saw some questions sort of pop up about being advocates, so I think I'm going to stay in that lane. But if you feel compelled to speak up or get involved in a way, there are a lot of great organizations. Equality Florida is certainly one of those. There are local community centers and LGBTQ youth programs all across the state. There are online programs, and they're doing work in different ways. Sometimes they're just creating like a kid zone space, or activities in community, or getting, the pride stuff organized for something they'll do. And then they do movie nights in the off season. There's a lot of different things that are happening. None of that's going to stop. We're going to go do this battle on Friday. And the politicians do what they do, and they sometimes take up a lot of space and blow a lot of hot air. And then the lawyers are going to get involved, and we're going to litigate. Like, the fight has levels and layers, but your affirming doctors and providers, your chosen family, your loved ones, your teachers, your guidance counselors, your media specialists, whoever are those humans that have been there to support you, will still be there. And that's important to know. And, ultimately, I do think these things always come around. I know where I started as a kid and where we are right now. And there are more resources and there's more equity across communities happening today than there was decades ago. And I know it's going to get better from here. I know that. Staying in my positive space.
Thank you so much for that, Nathan. How about you, Dr. Howe?
Yeah, I agree. I think part of the work that I do is really to create the space that's safe and affirming. And regardless of what comes down from this AHCA situation, I'll continue to provide the same affirming space, and we'll make things work in whatever way that we can. And I have no problem saying that confidently. Part of the advocacy role, I also teach graduate students in clinical psychology, so I'm constantly talking about this process of speaking up, and I used the quote today that's hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up, and that's really something that we talk about in activism work. Of really, we have to do the work, and it's hard, and it's at the end of the day, I'll be the one who goes home tired, but I'll try my best to make sure that my patients don't have to suffer in the same ways that maybe they did 5, 10, 20 years ago. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is just making sure there are other providers that are affirming, and really trying to stay connected. There's a village of us, and we really do work together to provide affirming care without being a gatekeeper. That's my biggest role.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Kasseri?
I agree with both. I will add to that and say that knowledge is power. So whether we're talking about social media posts, we can start having impact with the people around us. There's a lot of ignorance. I'm fortunate to be able to teach, so many medical students and include trans-focused topics in my teaching. But even if you're not in a position to teach, you're able to educate the people around you, bigoted family members, people that may not have an understanding of what it is that we're talking about or what the issue is today. You spreading that word will impact people in ways you might not know, because that might impact how they vote the next time voting is happening. Knowledge is power. So where you are able, share this knowledge and make sure that people know about trans folks and know about the attacks that they are receiving day in and day out. Raise hell, raise your voice. That I'll leave it on an upward note.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for joining us today. I just want to say, Dr. Howe, Dr. Kasseri, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for fighting and providing care to a community that doesn't often feel seen, that doesn't often feel heard. We need more people like you, and we're so thankful for you. And Nathan, thank you for always being a champion for LGBTQ folks, particularly trans folks. And thank you for all the work that you've done throughout the years to fight for our community. And for everyone out there watching, I'm going to say it one more time. There is a hearing on July 8th, but AHCA is accepting public comment on this particular notice. So please go to the website in the comment section to make comments regarding how gender affirming care is needed, how it has changed your life, and we need as many comments as you can make. Please don't be intimidated by it. If you go to that website, there are FAQs, there are tips, there are everything on there. And I just want to let you all know how you express yourself is valid, how you identify as valid. Us at Equality Florida are going to continue to fight for you, and this fight is not over. Our community is used to fighting, and we will continue to fight. So you all, thank you so much for joining us for TransChat. I am so thankful for each and every one of you, and we will be in touch. You all have a great day, okay?
Thank you.